More than a year ago now, I did a series on the main perspectives in philosophy of mind. I'd like to revisit that series to discuss a more recent development. And this is the idea of the extended mind, most famously defended by Andy Clark. He wrote a famous paper with David Chalmers called The Extended Mind, which really put this idea on the table of modern philosophy. So the big question in philosophy of mind is, how does mind relate to matter? That's the mind-body problem. And what the vast majority of philosophers have tended to assume is that this means, how does the mind relate to the brain and the body? As I said, it's called the mind-body problem. So the assumption is that this problem is about, the relation of the mind to the body, or specifically to the brain. Now, the extended mind claims that the mind is partially constituted by things in the external environment. The mind extends beyond the body. Various processes and objects in the world are literally parts of our minds. One way to start motivating this idea is to consider embodied cognition, or cognition that involves bodily processes beyond the brain. All through our lives, we make gestures, particularly when we're talking to people, but in many other contexts as well. Now, intuitively, we'd probably think of gesture as being a sort of incidental behaviour. It's something we do as a habit. It's expressive of certain thoughts and feelings, and it helps to communicate thoughts and feelings to other people, but that's about it. But some people have suggested that gesture is more important than this. Gesture isn't just expressive of thoughts, it's actually part of the process of thinking. So here's some intriguing facts. We gesture when we're talking on the phone, or when we're talking to ourselves, when nobody else would be able to see us. Even people who are blind from birth gesture. Gesture increases when a person is reasoning. When you're trying to work out a problem, you'll make more gestures. And gesture also increases with the difficulty of the problem. Especially intriguing are studies in which participants are asked to perform problem-solving tasks, and some of the participants are prevented from gesturing. For instance, they might be made to sit on their hands so that they can't move them. Now, when gesturing is prevented in this way, people perform significantly worse at the task. If you're interested in reading more about this stuff, check out the work of Susan Goldin-Meadow. So a natural conclusion when we consider this research is that gesturing is part of thinking. When you're given a mathematical problem, say, your whole body takes on the cognitive processing, not just your neurons. Now, obviously, the body isn't necessary. When people are prevented from gesturing, that doesn't make them incapable of solving the problems. But it does seem that the brain can recruit parts of the body to do some of the cognitive work for it. I mean, bear in mind that you could lose part of your brain and still be able to solve mathematical problems. You just wouldn't be able to solve them as easily. So it certainly seems plausible to say that, just as, for instance, solving a mathematical problem might involve various bits of the brain, it can also be literally constituted by parts of the body, by movements that you make with your hands and so on. So now the question is, if the mind can extend from the brain to the body, can it extend further, from the body into the environment? This is the thesis of the extended mind. Now, Clark and Chalmers use a couple of famous examples to motivate this idea. First of all, consider various people being asked to solve a very simple problem in Tetris. So the first person sees an image like this and is asked to tell us where this shape might best fit. We just see this image and they're asked, where would that shape fit best? And to figure this out, they have to mentally rotate the shape to see which slot it best fits into. The second person gets the same problem as the first, but the second person is allowed to use a button to manually rotate the shape. They're not just rotating it with their minds, they can make it rotate, and this will probably allow them to come up with an answer more quickly. The third person, a person from the future, can also make the shape rotate, but does it using a neural implant. The third person has an implant in the brain which does the same job as the button. Now, there's no question that the first case is an example of cognitive processing. Mental rotation is clearly an operation of the mind. With the third case, with the neural implant, this seems to be basically on a par with the first case. In principle, you should be able to use technology to augment the mind. If you install bits of technology in your brain, surely they could be part of your mind. But now this raises a question of what exactly is the difference between the third case and the second case. We're happy to say that rotation using a neural implant is cognitive, so why shouldn't manual rotation, just using your finger and pressing a button, why shouldn't that be cognitive? Of course, one obvious difference is that the neural implant is in the head, but it would be question-begging to appeal to that difference here. The thesis that the mind is just in the head is precisely what this example is supposed to challenge. So if we accept that rotating a Tetris square can be a mental operation, then it looks like there are going to be many mental operations that extend in the world. Consider Scrabble. If you've ever played Scrabble, one common technique is to randomly move the letters around the board because this helps prompt ideas for words. Well, in this case, it looks like the changing arrangement of letters on the Scrabble board becomes part of a cognitive operation. In fact, you can actually play Scrabble online. I played it on Facebook once, and you can press a button which randomises the letters for you. So if pressing a button and rotating a Tetris square is a mental process, then surely this is as well. Or consider cooking. When people cook, they will often organise their ingredients. They put the peppers here, then the tomatoes there, the carrots here, the spices there, and so on. They'll have this place for cooked meat, this place for uncooked meat. So they organise and structure the space in order to make the cooking easier, in order to improve their cognitive performance. It's just a way of helping to simplify the task. Another example might be a philosopher who uses writing to actively promote new ideas. Some philosophers can let ideas drift into their heads, but one good technique is to sit down and force yourself to start writing about a topic, and this can actually produce creativity. If you say, right, I'm going to talk about this topic, I'm going to write about it, and you force yourself to start writing, you might not have any ideas at first, but just the activity of writing can bring ideas forth. So that looks like another case of possibly extended cognition, and it looks like extended cognition could be a very pervasive feature of our lives. It's not just something in science fiction scenarios or artificial laboratory scenarios. The second example concerns two people, Inga and Otto. And this is probably Clark and Chalmers' most famous example, and I think probably their most persuasive of the two. So Inga wants to visit the Museum of Modern Art. She thinks for a second, remembers it's on 53rd Street, and she makes her way to 53rd Street. That's relatively straightforward. Now the important point here is that it seems pretty clear that Inga believes that the Museum of Modern Art is on 53rd Street, and she believed this even before she thought about it. The belief was in her memory, and she brought it to her conscious attention. You can have unconscious beliefs. In fact, the vast majority of your beliefs are unconscious most of the time. I assume that you have beliefs about all sorts of things, about dinosaurs, space, food, cars, medicine, and so on. You're not going to be consciously thinking of those. Those beliefs are stored in your unconscious memory until such a time as you need them or are reminded of them, or whatever. So, Inga believed that the museum was on 53rd Street. She recalled this, and she went to the museum. Okay, now Otto also wants to go to the Museum of Modern Art, but he has Alzheimer's. He doesn't remember things. Instead, he keeps a notebook with him at all times, where he writes down important information, phone numbers, locations, dates, events, and so on. Otto's notebook plays the same role for him that memory plays for normal people. So he checks the notebook, sees that the museum is on 53rd Street, and makes his way to 53rd Street. Now we say that Inga believed that the museum was on 53rd Street even before she checked her memory. The belief was unconscious. Well, similarly, Clark and Chalmers suggest that Otto believed that the museum was on 53rd Street even before he checked his notebook. The notebook contained an unconscious belief, in just the same way as Inga had an unconscious belief about the location before she consciously remembered it. Inga's belief was encoded in some part of her brain. Otto's belief is encoded in the notebook. Otto's notebook literally contains Otto's beliefs. Now this probably strikes you as a rather odd way of speaking, and you might say, well look, there's a much more intuitive way to describe what's going on with Otto. If we ask, why does Otto go to 53rd Street, we'd probably tell a story something like this. Otto desires to go to the Museum of Modern Art. He believes that the location is written in the notebook, so he checks the notebook and he comes to believe that it's on 53rd Street. Prior to checking the notebook, he didn't have any beliefs about the location of the museum. What he believed was that the location was written in the notebook. That's the more standard story. But now Clark and Chalmers point out, well, why don't we say exactly the same thing for Inga? If I ask, why does Inga go to 53rd Street? We can say, Inga desires to go to the museum. She believes that the location of the museum is in her memory, so she checks her memory and comes to believe that the museum is on 53rd Street. The problem with this kind of story is that it introduces pointless complexity. I mean, technically people do have to check their memories. There's some sort of cognitive processing going on that brings beliefs to consciousness. But we're happy to ascribe to people unconscious beliefs. So we can say that Inga has beliefs about the museum even when she's not thinking about it. Why shouldn't we say the same thing about Otto? I mean, remember, Otto has this notebook on him all the time. He uses it regularly every single day to help him get around the world. It plays the same role for him that biological memories do for Inga. To quote Clark and Chalmers, they say, "To say that beliefs disappear when the notebook is filed away seems to miss the big picture in just the same way as saying that Inga's beliefs disappear as soon as she is no longer conscious of them. In both cases, the information is reliably there when needed, available to consciousness and available to guide action in just the way that we expect a belief to be." An important idea here is the notion of coupling. Otto and his notebook constitute what Clark and Chalmers call a coupled system. Otto influences the notebook in turn influences the him. There's a mutual causal influence between the two. Both parts of the coupled system jointly determine behaviour. So Otto's walking to 53rd Street is a product of his desire to see the museum plus the information written in the notebook. Otto's cognitive performance, Otto's behaviour, many aspects of Otto's life are dependent on the mutual interaction between his brain and his notebook. Because of the way that both parts of this coupled system influence and constrain one another and mutually cause events, they can be modelled as a single system. So that's this idea of a coupled system. In later work, Clark also appeals to an analogy to turbocharging. A turbocharger is something you can put into cars to make them faster and more efficient. I might be wrong about this because I don't know anything about cars, but I think that essentially how they work is that they use the exhaust fumes to spin a turbine, and this helps to compress the air going into the engine, which kind of forces a higher fuel usage. The output of the engine, the exhaust fumes, are recycled and used to increase the power of the engine. So cars with a turbocharger they've sort of extended their power generating mechanism. In a normal car, the exhaust fumes play no role in generating power. They're just the waste. They're no longer relevant. But once you add the turbocharger, they play an essential role in generating power because they're recycled and used as an extra input. Clark wants to tell the same kind of story about minds. Brains can take outputs of cognitive activity and then recycle these as inputs to further cognitive activity. So take the example of gesture that we saw earlier. Gesture is caused by thinking, but then it goes on to stimulate thinking. Similarly, when the brain is coupled to external objects, these objects can turbocharge cognitive processing. And here these objects can be seen as part of we can sort of see cognitive processing as extended to these objects, just as the exhaust fumes of a car are part of an extended power generator. So external objects can be part of extended cognition. Now let me note an important point here. The claim that Clark and Chalmers are making is not that the notebook itself is mental. It's not that the notebook itself constitutes Otto's beliefs. Rather, the idea is that Otto's beliefs are constituted by the coupled system of Otto plus the notebook. So this is very important. The brain still plays an essential role. No part of the external world can be cognitive on its own. External things only become part of an extended mind when they're coupled to the brain in the right kind of way. So if Otto dies, the notebook no longer contains any beliefs. The extended mind requires this ongoing interaction between the notebook and Otto's brain. Now, another central idea in Clark and Chalmers' paper is the Parity Principle, which states, if, as we confront some task, a part of the world functions as a process which, were it done in the head, we would have no hesitation in recognising as part of the cognitive process, then that part of the world is part of the cognitive process. The point is that we can't simply insist, by definition, that the mind is something that can only exist in the head or in the body. If we want to say that minds are limited to bodily processes, then we have to provide some relevant distinction between bodily processes and processes in the external environment. With Inga and Otto, for instance, we have to explain what the relevant difference is between Inga's biological memory and Otto's notebook. Clark and Chalmers think there just are no relevant differences. I mean, of course, this is fairly questionable. One early objection was that biological memory has a number of features that Otto's notebook doesn't. Biological memory is very easily influenced by other people. A famous study by Loftus and Palmer took 150 students and showed them a film of a car accident. After viewing the film, 50 students were asked how fast were the cars going when they hit each other. Another 50 were asked how fast were the cars going when they smashed each other. And the remaining 50 weren't asked any question. Now, smashed, of course, is a much stronger word than hit, right? The group who asked how fast the cars were going when they hit each other estimated the cars to be travelling at 8 miles an hour. The group who were asked how fast they were going when they smashed estimated them to be travelling at 10.46 miles an hour. Furthermore, a week later, the groups were asked, did you see any broken glass? Now, there was no broken glass in the film, but 7 of the hit group said yes, and 16 of the smashed group said yes. 6 of the control group, the group who weren't asked any questions, said yes. So what this appears to show is that the words we use when asking a question about an event can alter your memory of it. By saying smashed rather than hit, people will estimate a greater speed, and they'll be more likely to believe that they saw glass when they didn't. So memory has this interesting feature that just by sort of phrasing questions in slightly different ways, you can really change people's recall of events. Second, biological memory exhibits the serial position effect. Basically, if we're shown a list of words, for instance, and then asked to recall the words, we're better at recalling the first and the last items of the list. The ones in the middle are more easily forgotten. Third, the context effect. We're better at recalling things when we're in the same context in which we learned them. If you learn something at work while on a computer, while wearing a suit, it'll be harder for you to recall it if you're at home watching TV in pyjamas. Biological memory is dependent on contextual cues. I think people can sort of use this to help improve their performance in exams. So, they'll have, I don't know, if you wear if you wear certain clothes all the time whenever you do revision, and then you put on those same clothes for the exam, that might actually help you because you've sort of come to associate those clothes with that information. Another feature is chunking. So here's an example from Wikipedia. Let's say you're asked to memorise a bunch of random letters like this. Well, that's not so easy. What you can do is group them together to form familiar things like this. Notice that, of course, MD, PhD, RSVP, CEO, they're all common acronyms. If you try to memorise this list, it's much easier. If you group the letters into chunks, especially if some of the chunks are familiar, then you'll be much more likely to retain the information. And the point is that we don't get any of this stuff with notebooks. What you write in the notebook stays in the notebook. It doesn't make any difference whether or not it's chunked like this, or what the first or last items were, what order you write things in. It doesn't make any difference. These are just a few examples of interesting memory effects. There are numerous others. The point is that biological memory isn't simply a store of information like a notebook. It's dynamic, it changes as the individual develops, it can easily be manipulated. So the objection is that actually there are all sorts of differences between Inga's biological memory and Otto's notebook. Now, I think this is quite an interesting point, but there's a fairly obvious response to it, which is that, well, what we need is not just any difference. It has to be a relevant difference. And it's not clear that any of these kinds of differences are actually relevant. Otto's notebook doesn't play exactly the same kind of role as biological memory, but it plays a sufficiently similar role to be counted as cognitive. Suppose that in the future we were to develop some sort of drug that could make memories better. If you take the drug, it renders memory impervious to the effects I noted just now. Or suppose that we were to encounter some race of extraterrestrials whose memories really just are stores of information. They don't exhibit the same effects of our memories. Surely it would be completely outrageous to say that actually these aren't memories because they're not exactly the same as our biological memories. It's not a necessary feature of memory that it exhibit the chunking effect or the serial position effect. So the fact that Otto's notebook doesn't have these effects doesn't mean that it's not a legitimate form of memory. Another difference that is maybe somewhat more important is that Inga accesses her memory through something like introspection. She has an immediate and direct access to her beliefs about the location of the museum. Otto, on the other hand, relies on perception. The notebook is accessed through sensory mechanisms. Now, this seems like a plausible candidate for a relevant difference. Clark and Chalmers do anticipate this objection, but they suggest it begs the question. I quote, "We are advocating a point of view on which Otto's internal processes and his notebook constitute a single cognitive system. From the standpoint of this system, the flow of information between notebook and brain is not perceptual at all. It does not involve the impact of something outside the system. It is more akin to information flow within the brain." In other words, if we accept the extended mind hypothesis, then we won't describe Otto as perceiving something out in the external world. Instead, when information is sent from the notebook to his eyes, down the optic nerve to the brain, this is occurring within a single system. Just like in Inga's case, populations of neurons send messages to other populations of neurons. We treat that as a single system. Even though there may be distinct populations of neurons, we treat it as one system. Well, in the same way, the extended mind treats Otto and his notebook as a single system. So when Otto looks at his notebook, this is actually more like introspection. It's information being passed around within the system rather than perception, which involves the mind acquiring information from the world outside. Now, I must say, I'm not so convinced about this. Consider that even if we accept the extended mind, strictly speaking, what's part of Otto's mind is the information written in the notebook, not the notebook itself. So the random marks on the pages, the imperfections on the paper, or an accidental scribble, that wouldn't count as part of his mind. Now, in that case, both the opponents and the supporters of the extended mind can agree that when Otto sees those random marks, he's perceiving them. Okay, that's standard perception. The mind is acquiring information about something that's not part of the mind, something that's part of the external world. But if seeing those random marks is perception, surely seeing the written sentences must be perception as well. It's literally exactly the same process each time. Perception is just the name of a particular sort of, mechanical process. So that might be a problem. Nevertheless, hopefully you can see the motivation for this theory. Now, assuming we find it plausible, there is a big worry here, the worry of cognitive bloat. So, just how far does the mind extend? I'd say that I don't have any beliefs about the lives of Christian popes between 800 AD and 900 AD. Were there any Christian popes back? I think there were. I think there were Christian popes between that time, but I don't have any beliefs about it. I know nothing about the history of the papacy. But right now I'm at a computer which has internet access, and I spend a lot of time on this computer. Realistically, most of my day is spent either on or near this computer. It would be fairly easy for me to go to Google and search any number of things about medieval popes. So, does that mean that I actually do have beliefs about medieval popes? You could say that the store of information on the internet plays a similar role for me as the store of information in my brain. Does my mind extend into the computer? Does it extend into the local library? Well, I assume that these would be absurd conclusions, but how do we rule them out? This is the problem of cognitive bloat. Along with the Parity Principle, Clark and Chalmers propose 4 conditions that part of the world must meet in order to count as part of the mind, which have come to be known as trust and glue conditions. First of all, the resource must be reliably available and frequently used. It has to be something that's with you pretty much all the time and that you use often. Otto carries his notebook with him everywhere, and he frequently checks it. Of course, there are occasions when he doesn't have it on him, like when he's in the shower, but then there are also occasions where more standard cognitive resources won't be available. If you've been given anaesthetics, you won't be able to feel pain. If you're in the dark, you won't be able to see. As long as Otto carries his notebook with him for most of the day, that's good enough. Second, information retrieved from the resource must be automatically endorsed. We automatically trust our memories. Of course, we might be given new information which makes us doubt our memories, but in the absence of contradicting evidence, we take memory as being reasonably reliable. In the same way, Otto trusts his notebook. When Otto reads that the museum is on 53rd Street, he goes straight to 53rd Street without a second thought, just like you would if you had that information in your biological memory. Third, the information contained in the resource should be easily accessible when it's required. Recalling things from biological memory doesn't take any work. It's there when we need it. Now this, I think, is where we might start to worry about the example with Otto. It's not difficult for Otto to use his notebook, but it requires much more work than biological memory does. Otto first must take the notebook out of his pocket. Then he has to flick through it, maybe check the index. If he uses his notebook to store a lot of information, it won't be immediately obvious where the specific items are. I suppose the same is sometimes true of biological memory. You might have like the name of a film on the tip of your tongue. You know it, but you can't bring it forward. That's relatively rare though. Most of the time we remember what we need immediately. But Clark and Chalmers certainly assume that the information in Otto's notebook is easily enough accessible. Fourth, the information has been consciously endorsed at some point in the past and is there as a consequence of this endorsement. At some point in the past, Otto was consciously aware of the location of the museum, and this caused him to write the location of the museum in his notebook. If I were to come along while Otto was asleep and write something in his notebook, this wouldn't count as one of his beliefs because he never endorsed it. Now, Clark and Chalmers are somewhat on the fence about this last condition. They point out that people can have things in their biological memories that they never endorsed. You can pick things up subliminally, for instance. People can tamper with your memories during hypnosis or whatever. Arguably, the Loftus and Palmer study that we saw earlier is a kind of example of this. Biological memories can very easily be manipulated. But I don't know, I think that this fourth condition is arguably the most important one of all. Let's say that instead of carrying a notebook, I carry one of those Kindle things. I've never used one, but I've heard they're like iPods for books. Well, let's say I have a Kindle and I load it with a load of encyclopedias and textbooks and so on, and I've got a whole library in my pocket. Well, this electronic library would probably meet the first 3 conditions. My Kindle is readily available and frequently used. I might automatically endorse the information I get from a book that I look up in it, and the information might be easily accessible. Because it might have, say, a sort of Google-type search function. You type in a word or phrase and it searches through all of the books for hits of that word or phrase. I don't know if Kindle does this, but it could do. The technology could be made for it to do that. Now, we don't want to say that I believe everything in all these encyclopedias and textbooks. It seems to me that the only way to rule this out, if we accept the extended mind theory, is to have something like the fourth condition. Without this, I can just upload a bunch of textbooks on volcanoes to my Kindle, and bam, I'm an expert volcanologist. Okay, so a couple of points that I think are worth noting. First, I note that Clark and Chalmers do accept that consciousness is probably located wholly within the brain. Some philosophers have argued that consciousness itself is extended. I've not found those proposals all that plausible. But anyway, we all accept that there's more to the mind than consciousness. So the extended mind doesn't entail extended consciousness. Second, Clark and Chalmers both focus on cognition and cognitive processes. So cognitive processes relate to reasoning, rationality, belief, intelligence, memory, problem solving, and so on. This leads me to an interesting new development of the extended mind, extended affectivity. Affectivity concerns feelings and emotions. Even if you think it's plausible that cognitive processes can extend, can feelings? Well, a recent paper by Giovanna Colombetti and Tom Roberts suggests that yes, they can. Colombetti and Roberts distinguish emotional episodes from emotional dispositions. Consider the statement, Mary is angry at John. This might mean that Mary is currently experiencing an occurrent anger towards John, with the associated physiological changes. So in this case, Mary might actually quite like John overall, she's just angry with him at the moment. That's an emotional episode. Or it might mean that Mary has a sort of long-standing disposition of anger towards John. So she's just kind of in general angry towards John. She doesn't like him. We'd say, even if she's currently feeling very happy, we'd still say, oh, she's angry towards John. So that's an emotional disposition. Emotional dispositions can be unconscious, just like beliefs can. So consider first emotional dispositions. Colombetti and Roberts take the example of a woman called Eve, who harbours a lot of resentment towards her parents. Imagine also that she always carries a diary with her to record things in her daily life. Now, whenever her parents do anything that frustrates her or makes her angry, she records this in her diary. Her diary contains loads of negative comments about her parents, which she sometimes rereads, and when she does, it brings all the resentment back to the surface. Colombetti and Roberts suggest that this is an example of extended resentment. Since she carries the diary with her at all times, it meets Clark and Chalmers' trust and glue conditions, and it also clearly meets the parity principle. I mean, if Eve simply rehearsed statements about her parents in her head, and this brought up her resentment, we would consider that an uncontroversial mental process. Or consider the use of a notebook to improve one's mood. Take a person who's prone to depression or anxiety or whatever. They might start collecting motivational phrases, positive stories, accounts of their own successes and achievements. They collect all of this in a notebook, and whenever they read it, it helps to lift their spirits. Over time, they consult the notebook again and again, and this helps to push them to improve their general mood. Their basic temperament changes. Rather than being generally depressed and anxious, they become happy and assertive. Well, plausibly, their happiness and assertiveness is partially constituted by the notebook. One thing to bear in mind with this case and with Eve is that they're both examples of coupling, and they both exhibit the turbocharging effect. Eve's resentment of her parents causes her to write down negative thoughts, and these thoughts then promote further and deeper resentment. One worry about these cases is that they're really just examples of extended beliefs, like Otto and his notebook. We might say that Eve records beliefs about her parents, and when she looks in her diary, she sees these beliefs, and these prompt the resentment. Similarly, positive stories, positive sayings, stories of your own successes, they're really matters of belief. Colombetti and Roberts point out that this needn't be the case. Eve's notebook might contain not just statements but pictures. In the example of the depressed, anxious person, the positive sayings might be imperatives. So, for instance, keep it up or go for it. Well, those obviously aren't beliefs, they're commands. In fact, maybe a better example along these lines might be the use of a stress ball or something like that. That clearly doesn't involve belief, it's just a repetitive movement. Well, for somebody who carries a stress ball everywhere with them, which helps them to keep calm, it's plausible that this ball partially constitutes their calmer disposition. Okay, so what about emotional episodes? Not just long-term dispositions, but occurrent feelings. It's one thing for external objects to help prompt feelings and so partially constitute emotional dispositions, But can those occurrent feelings themselves, in some sense, be constituted by things in the world? Well, maybe a good example here is music. Tom Cochrane has argued that in musical improvisation, for instance, a jazz musician doing a saxophone solo, the emotions of the jazz performer are partially constituted by the processes going on in the saxophone. And these are the immediate motions, the immediate feelings are constituted by things that he's doing with the saxophone. Right, so, first of all, Cochrane argues that what's essential to emotion are patterns of bodily changes. Fear is partially constituted by bodily changes such as higher pulse rate, higher blood pressure, flooding of adrenaline, changes of facial features, changes of posture, and so on. What's going on when you experience fear is that your brain is tracking bodily processes such as these. Now, there's quite a lot of evidence for this idea. For instance, we know that if people have Botox injections or experience strokes, this can lead to a weakening of the facial muscles. The muscles don't move as much, they're not as expressive. These people often report dampened emotional experience. So just because their facial muscles have been weakened, their emotions have correspondingly lost their power. Similarly, if you act in an angry way, for instance by screaming, by punching things, by being aggressive, this will make you feel angrier. Incidentally, this is one reason why most psychologists reject the idea that you can let out your anger by punching inanimate objects. So that's something people sometimes do. People think that, well, if you're feeling angry, just let it out, punch a pillow. But a number of studies have found that violent behaviour like punching pillows actually only makes people more prone to anger and to further violence. What you should do if you are feeling angry or feeling violent is sit down and calm down, listen to calming music. You have to break the cycle of responding to anger by lashing out. If you act angry, you'll just become more angry. Second, Cochrane endorses the resemblance theory of musical expression. To put it in a slogan, music sounds the way that emotions feel. Or more formally, a piece of music expresses an emotion X when that piece of music resembles the way that X is expressed in our behaviour and physiological reactions. A piece of music sounds sad when it resembles the way that we express sadness. For instance, if a piece of music is slow and droopy, it will probably seem sad because it resembles the slow, droopy behaviour of a sad person. A lot of heavy metal music is loud, fast and dissonant. This makes it sound angry because it resembles the aggressive shouting of an angry person. Anger makes our pulse rate rise, so it's faster. It makes us loud, makes us hot and agitated. So that those sort of qualities, when they're put into music, make the music sound angry. Both of these claims are controversial, but they allow us to make a case for extended emotional episodes. Remember, the first claim is that emotions are partially constituted by bodily changes. Emotions arise from the brain tracking bodily changes. By acting sad, by behaving in sad ways, or changing your expression so as to look sad, you can make yourself feel genuinely sad. Now, when the jazz improviser plays a sad tune, the music will resemble the way he behaves and the psychological changes he undergoes when he feels sad. Cochrane suggests, essentially, that the brain can come to treat musical patterns in the same way it treats bodily patterns. Producing sad music is basically just another way of acting sad. Just as making sad facial expressions can depress your mood, so can playing a sad tune on a saxophone. The processes going on in the saxophone come to play the same functional role as processes going on in the body. So the emotion of sadness is quite literally extended to the saxophone. For the improviser, the music produced by the instrument fulfills the same role as bodily states. And what's notable about improvisation is that because the performer is relatively free to play what they want, for as long as they want, we get the important features of coupling and turbocharging. The improviser feels sad about something. This prompts him to start playing sad notes. These notes then produce greater sadness because the brain treats the notes in the same way it would treat bodily states. So these kind of sad notes produce produce greater sadness, and then that then leads to more sad notes, and so on. The improviser's overall emotional state is constituted by a dynamic interaction between his brain, his body, and his instrument. So we get this kind of this coupling between the improviser and the instrument, and the instrument turbocharges his emotional states. And this, I think, is not such an unusual way of treating musical instruments. Many musicians tend to they tend to feel that musical instruments are sort of extensions of their bodies, especially when they become proficient at them. And I suppose this kind of view is maybe not so counterintuitive. I mean, when we listen to music, it often seems to us to have emotional qualities. Just as we see objects as being coloured, we see the colours in the objects. It's often as though we hear emotions in the music. It's as though in some sense the emotional qualities are contained within the sounds. Now, one account of this is projection. We might say that music makes us experience emotions and then we project those feelings onto the music. But if we accept extended affectivity, then it can actually make sense to say that music literally contains emotions. When the jazz musician plays a solo that sounds sad, it's not that we're projecting sadness onto the music literally contains the jazz musician's sadness. One thing that underpins a lot of work in the extended mind is a commitment to functionalism. I have a video on functionalism, so go and review that if you've forgotten about it. But the basic idea is that mental states are defined in terms of their causal roles. Pain, for instance, is a state that is caused by bodily damage and that causes distress and nursing of the damaged area. Anything that has the right causal profile is a pain. Functionalism is quite congenial to the extended mind hypothesis because we can take things in the external world, for instance Otto's notebook, and say that they play the same functional role as events in the head. I mean, that's the basis of the Parity Principle. The Parity Principle says that if some process in the world plays the same role as processes in the head, then we can count it as cognitive. So you can see the importance of functionalism here. But I think it's worth noting that you don't need to be a functionalist to accept the extended mind. To illustrate this, I want to consider a recent development, the socially extended mind, which is supported by Sean Gallagher. Gallagher doesn't try to characterise mental states in functional terms, and he actually rejects the Parity Principle. Clark and Chalmers look at the functional role of standard mental states, and then they say that anything else that plays the same functional role is also a mental state, and this supports the extended mind. Gallagher comes at it from a very different angle. According to Gallagher, certain social practices are mental institutions, in the sense that they are not only institutions with which we accomplish certain cognitive processes, but are also such that without them, such cognitive processes would no longer exist. For instance, legal systems and scientific research practices. So consider a legal judgment, for instance, a verdict of guilty in a court. Well, this is obviously cognitive. Issuing a judgment clearly involves mental states. But Gallagher suggests that this judgment doesn't simply occur in an individual's head. Instead, there are a variety of processes and practices in the social institution of the law and the court system that help to form that judgment. The guilty verdict and the cognitive processes that lead to the guilty verdict are partially constituted by the various rules and processes of the legal system. Let's take a concrete example. So Gallagher considers 3 scenarios. A woman called Alexis is given some facts and asked to make a legal judgment. In the first scenario, she has to make her judgment based on her subjective sense of fairness. She weighs the evidence entirely in her head. In the second, experts specify the kinds of questions she can address, the kinds of considerations she can make, although again much of the deliberation beyond this is largely in her head. In the third, the experts not only tell her what sorts of considerations she can make, they provide her with possible answers, and they provide her with rules she has to follow when coming to her decision. Now Gallagher suggests that in all these cases, Alexis's cognition is extended into the world. I'm not sure this is so plausible for the first case, but consider the third case. This is, I think, the important one. Here, Alexis's decision is significantly shaped and constrained by the experts who advise her, and their advice is based on the rules of an established legal system. Alex has to do far less cognitive work here than in the first case, or at least she has to do a completely different kind of cognitive work than in the first case. In the third case, it seems like her cognition is sort of tightly coupled to the experts and the general legal system. As Gallagher says, when individuals like Alexis and the experts become engaged with the system in the right way, the system does some of the cognitive work. Also note that the legal judgment she ultimately makes is what it is only in the context of the system. If Alexis delivers a verdict of guilty, this only makes sense in the context of the particular legal institution she's engaged in. People are only guilty relative to particular legal systems. It wouldn't make any sense to say that somebody is guilty independently of social context. I mean, obviously you can describe the action in an objective manner. So let's say John kills Jim. Well, if John has killed Jim, then John's killing of Jim is independent of any social context. That's something that's dependent on just biological facts. But to say that John is guilty of killing Jim is a legal judgment. It requires a legal system. It requires a law against killing in that case. And it requires that not just that John has killed Jim, but that he's killed him in the right kind of way. Some killing is, at least in some legal systems, some killing is perfectly acceptable. Killing in self-defense, killing in the context of war. So the point is that Alexis's cognitive processes simply wouldn't be possible if she wasn't engaged with the legal system. The judgment she comes to, this judgment of guilty, is kind of dependent on this established legal system with certain rules and certain practices. Now, none of this depends on saying that parts of the legal institution play a similar functional role as processes going on in Alexis's head. I mean, presumably they're actually very different. So Gallagher thinks that the parity principle is just too conservative. Requiring that external processes play the same functional role as internal ones illegitimately restricts the scope of the extended mind. Gallagher wants to say that it can that even things that are totally different can constitute parts of our minds. Our minds can be extended even in those cases. Right. Well, so that's the extended mind. We've seen Clark and Chalmers' basic idea, their famous example of Inga and Otto, and we've looked at a couple of extensions of it. So I will do another video at some point where we look at some criticisms, but for today I think that is enough. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.